He had been moving through the city like a man who owned its schedules. Brennan Ashford's steps were brisk, practiced, 1, 2, 3, between the puddles and the scuffed tiles of the downtown subway platform. His coat was cut sharp enough to leave little lines in the air. The collar smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's success. He was late because the morning had demanded of him what mornings demanded of billionaires: decisions, calls, a parade of small emergencies that required someone to be unbothered and decisive. He had, until that moment, treated the world as a chessboard where each piece obeyed the hand that placed it. On the far edge of the platform, where the light thinned and the drafts looked through people like questions, sat a woman with a 6-year-old asleep across her knees. The child's head lolled, mouth open in a quiet child's hush, a knot of dark hair caught under a woolen hat. The woman, Sutton Reeves, held Indy like she was a fragile, private country, elbows in, chin down, eyes half closed against the cold and the noise, face a map of small, stubborn weather. Her coat had seen seasons. It was warm enough that she had traded vanity for survival. Beside her, a faded backpack guarded a flattened box with a child's crayon scribble, a couple of paper plates, and a small stuffed animal that had lost its ear. There was a cardboard sign propped nearby, the letters patient and not showy. Single mom, lost my job, anything helps, thank you. Brennan stopped at the escalator, caught sight of the tableau as if someone had flipped on a projector in his head. He had seen images like this all his life, on his father's desk, in charity reports, in the seasonal newsletters his company sent. But those had been aestheticized poverty, statistics with glossy graphs. This was different. It had hands. It had a child whose eyelashes made better shadows than any of his executive portraits. Montgomery Ashford's voice threaded through Brennan's mind in the way old lessons often do, lessons that were equal parts doctrine and taunt. People get the kind of help they earn, his father had said. You cannot coddle greed. You must test it. The world is soft enough already. Montgomery had been a man who measured gratitude like ledger entries. Generosity was an instrument of determining character. Brennan had been raised to think of the poor as a study in human motive. Will they spend, save, take as much as they can? The question was supposed to reveal something immutable about human nature. He watched Sutton as if he were reading a particularly stubborn line of code, waiting for the predictable output. She shifted the child's head on her knees, smoothed a tangle of hair with the heel of her hand, and pulled a fair-bred blanket tighter around both of them. Indy murmured in her sleep and turned toward her mother, smile soft and easy, the kind of small trust that reassured and broke people at once. Brennan's foot moved forward before his thought did. The surge of impulse was something he had grown rich enough to afford, sudden, unexamined, sharp. He stepped down from the escalator and closed the distance with the natural assurance of a man used to being noticed. Sutton raised her head as if startled by the sudden movement of a hawk. When Brennan reached her, he felt for a second like an awkward intruder in a domestic scene he had no right to be in. "Morning," he said. It was the most ordinary thing he could think to offer, and it sounded stilted against the clang of trains. Sutton's eyes measured him the way you measure a stranger who might ask a favor or offer one. There was no pitch in her face, no expectation, just an owned exhaustion, like a garment she had learned to wear. Instead of asking for money, Brennan did something entirely out of scale with the moment. He unbuttoned his coat, reached into an inner pocket, and took out a card. It was the kind of card that wanted to be photographed, matte black, a strip of pale silver, no numbers showing, just a name and an emblem that said wealth without needing to explain itself. "I want to do an experiment," he said, before he could find the restraint to stop himself. He hadn't planned the speech. He hadn't planned the surrendering. It was a curiosity shoved into action. "Take this. Use it for the next 24 hours. Do whatever you need to. Nothing more, nothing less." Sutton blinked. She looked at the card as if it were an object from another planet placed gently on her palm. The idea struck her as absurd, reckless, maybe a kind of joke. People gave money, she knew. People gave it in small, embarrassed envelopes, sometimes in coins. People rarely handed over options and said, "Here, spend this freely." The world had ways of explaining her place. This card did not fit into any of them. "Why?" she asked, the question shaped more like a reflex than an accusation. Brennan shrugged. There it was, no grandiloquence. "To see," he said simply, "to see what you'd do." The words landed with the weight of his father's voice, and he felt a flicker of shame at the ease with which he repeated that same test. He was, he realized, with a quick stabby shame, performing his inherited cynicism like a social experiment. But something else pulled him, an odd hope that if the results were ugly, they would vindicate him. If they were good, they'd give him a reason to believe in something other than ledger lines. Sutton's hands turned the card. She read the name written in embossed letters, Brennan Ashford. It felt obscene, like holding someone else's signature for a private moment. For a woman who had learned to treat gifts as temporary measures, not safety nets, there was 1,000 small ways to refuse. Pride had rules, too. "I can't take that," she said finally. 24 hours, Brennan interrupted, the phrase out before he realized he had rehearsed it inwardly. Just one day, nobody attached to it, no strings. Sutton's mouth tightened. Her child exhaled against her lap, small lungs working through fuelless sleep. She thought of bills folded into a single sheet of paper in some pocketless place. She thought of the last time Indy had asked for a proper coat, and she had lied about the cold. She thought, not with grand rhetoric, but with the real arithmetic of the week, where the next milk would come from, whether a cold would mean missed work, whether the city's shelters would have room tonight. There were practicalities to life that could crush you, but there were also thin rules she had built for herself to keep dignity from slipping too fast. "One day," she said, and the card felt like a pulse in her palm. "I won't sell it. I won't use it for anything I don't need. I promise." He nodded. The promise was sealed with nothing more than her voice, and the card slid into her wallet like a quiet weapon. Brennan felt oddly exposed, like a man who had turned his country into a petty scandal and handed the verdict to a stranger. He turned to leave because there were calls that would interpret his absence as irresponsibility, boards that met, investors who expected the sort of steady that made the world obedient. He walked back up the escalator with the city opening in front of him, and before he reached the lobby of his car, he had already pulled his phone from an inner pocket. He opened an app, the one tied to the account the card would link to, and watched the little icon that would let him track every swipe. There it was, an empty transaction log, the silence before sound. He labeled the experiment in his head, Test, Father, Proof. When he got into the car, his driver, always on schedule, always an apologetic buffer between his life and the rest of the world, took the route that hugged the river. Brennan did not speak. The city slid by in buildings and reflections. His phone buzzed once with a news alert. He did not open it. He opened his bank's app instead and stared at the clean interface like it was a new book. Back on the platform, Sutton folded the card into the far corner of her wallet and closed it with a practiced thumb.
The world didn't look like it had changed. Her life still had the same angles and the same thin lines. She stood up slowly, child still asleep, bag on her back, and walked toward the promenade, where, behind the strip of concrete, there were another dozen people who had their own kinds of privation. Her feet knew the city routes that meant shelter or a friendly cafe where a manager would look the other way. There were places where a person could do small things to keep their head above whatever had become the new tide. She went to the corner store first. The bell above the door rang like the prelude to a small private act. The cashier knew her enough to smile without needing to know why she was there. Sutton moved through the aisles with a calm that had nothing to do with the flash of the card in its pocket and everything to do with habit. She selected items that would stretch and feed. Chicken breasts, apples, a small pack of diapers hidden behind a cereal box, a jar of peanut butter. On the children's shelf she found a coat, good enough, warm, green with a subtle hood that had a fake fur rim. It was not designer, it was not bold, it was the color of salt and paper clips. Indy, when she woke, would recognize the warmth and the small miracle of warmth. She would not know about the card. Her happiness would be uncommodified and grateful, like a sun that had not been manufactured for the moment. At the register, Sutton laid the items out, and the cashier rang them with the soft efficiency of someone who'd seen the same transactions, yet was always surprised anew by what people prioritized. When it came time, she handed the card and watched the cashier's index finger hover, because even the people behind counters had terms for what was appropriate. She typed in the PIN, a 4-digit string she'd never thought she would enter on anyone else's credit. The machine chimed authorization. The first ping went through, $54.27. It vibrated Brennan's phone like an unusual private lightning bolt. He had imagined a crescent of alarms, extravagant dinners, impulsive items, a sudden shopping spree that proved his father's hypothesis right. Instead, the notification read, Corner Grocer, $54.27. He breathed out unexpectedly. Breathing out felt almost like disavowal. He wanted the test to show human nature as his father had told him it was. He wanted certainty. He wanted cases to be neat. The first beep was small, and his stomach knotted at the calmness of it. The night that followed was arranged in 2 frames. In Brennan's world, the night had a soundtrack of bloodless luxury, an office that hummed with climate control, a glass of something old and clear, the view from 32 floors up where the city lights were like a map of other people's choices. He sat by a window the size of a church wall and watched the city being itself, noisier in the lower streets, but from his height the night felt manageable, as if distance had a moral quality that made everything cooler. In Sutton's world, the night was a ledger of practicalities. After the corner store, she bought a cheap thermos for hot water, some bandages, a little children's medicine, nothing showy, and then she did something that had not crossed Brennan's anticipations at all. At a small shelter that took donations in the rear hallway, she handed over a paper slip with $15 written on the line marked Donation and a note that said, For the women who come in tonight, please make sure someone has a blanket. The shelter volunteer took the gift with a stunned smile, and the exchange was reduced to simple human courtesy that neither sought attention nor deserved scandal. Brennan watched each ping, the phone a metronome of small acts, $9.13, $3.50, $15. The pings came with a rhythm that unsettled him, nothing like a cascade of indulgence, but steady and disturbingly generous in a horizontal way. He sat and read them like messages from another life. Each notification was a fragment of the woman's priorities translated into numbers, the cost of a coat, the price of bandages, the amount she gave to someone else, while she herself remained, in his mind, a case study. The phone lit the room like an altar. Derek, his driver, texted from time to time with updates about the schedule. Brennan didn't answer. He watched his screen as if the arrangement were a theatrical performance, and he had front-row seats. Sutton Reeves had $54.27 at Corner Grocer. Sutton Reeves had $29.99 at Kids Outfitters. Sutton Reeves had $15 at St. Mary's Shelter. When the pins slowed, Brennan realized sleep was an enemy he couldn't quite face. He walked through rooms that were full of objects that had been bought to create a life, but had instead begun to create an echo of one. There were statues from travels he didn't remember taking, books that had been bought to impress committees, framed photographs of work trips. He felt smaller than the furniture. He felt like someone who had cropped himself from the photograph of his own life and wondered what was left. Down on the street, Sutton found a bench with an overhang and sat for a while, watching Indy wake up and squint at the light. The child's cheeks were full of sleep, and a faint smudge of dried milk at the corner of her mouth. Sutton put the new coat over the child's shoulders. Indy lifted her face, blinked, and gasped because the hood made everything suddenly safer. She laughed at the way the fur tickled her chin, an unforeseen happiness that made Sutton's chest unclench like an accordion. That was all she needed from the morning, to know that her daughter would not shiver. She kept the card in the back pocket of her wallet during the day. She used it for small things and refused small temptations. No extra toy, no trendy snack that cost more than cents. She counted every dollar as if conserving dignity required arithmetic. There was a moment when she stopped to talk to another woman in the shelter lobby who had a way of telling a life story in the tilt of her head and the sadness of her smile. The other woman spoke of a son with asthma, of missed rent, of a frost-bitten winter passed in an uneasy sleep. Sutton listened, and then, because she could, and because it felt like the only sensible human currency she had left, reached into her wallet, found the slip of receipt she'd kept folded, and scribbled the shelter volunteer's name on its back with a note, "For blankets tonight." It was an invisible handoff. She would not make announcements about the gesture. Giving had rules, too. Brennan's phone did not sleep. Each notification was a small bell, and he began to watch them for patterns like the way you watch a heart monitor for any aberration.
His brain, trained on patterns of markets and human capital, tried to derive a formula: if poor, then ragged; if given capital, then hoarding or frivolity. The pings refused to play along. The list compiled itself like a secret ledger. 7:14 p.m., Corner Grocer, $54.27, chicken breasts, apples, diapers, peanut butter, thermos. 7:42 p.m., Kids Outfitters, $29.99, child's winter coat, size 6. 8:05 p.m., Pharmacy, $12.83, children's acetaminophen, Band-Aids, Band-Aids, Band-Aids. 8:26 p.m., St. Mary's Shelter, $15, donation for blankets. The list kept him awake in a way that was quieter than guilt and louder than curiosity. He expected detachment to be easy, but it wasn't. The night's silence pressed itself into the space behind his eyes like a waiting room. He found himself turning the list over, imagining the contours of Sutton's day, the lines of a receipt, as if it could define the person who signed it. Montgomery's voice returned in fragments. "People take what they can get," the old man had said. "The problem with giving is you never know whether you're training someone to expect more." Brennan imagined Monty in his study, a cigar burning down to ash in a marble dish, and thought of the imperatives that had become his father's commandments. He felt like a child again under the weight of them. At 10:13 p.m. there came a new ping. It was small, almost anonymous. $6.48, late-night diner, coffee and 2 grilled cheeses. The simplicity of it made Brennan's chest tighten. It wasn't a late-night spree in an upscale place. It was 2 plain sandwiches and a coffee. The notification read like a whisper. By the time the city sighed toward midnight, Brennan had replayed his father's lessons a dozen different ways and had logged every small receipt as evidence for some claim he still couldn't articulate. He imagined the receipts like a moral language he could translate into truth. Instead, the receipts taught him of a different grammar, one where needs were arranged in order of affection. When the night stretched into hours with no new pings, he let his apartment become smaller than himself. He tried to sleep and failed. The silence on the transaction feed began to feel like an accusation. Either the experiment had failed because she had misused the card and taken it somewhere no notification could follow, or she had done something he hadn't forecast. At a little after 2 in the morning, his phone trembled with a pattern of vibrations that made him leap to attention. The screen lit in a cold blue. A new charge had appeared. Midtown Pharmacy, $9.62. Cough syrup, bandages, vitamin C gummies for kids. His first sensation was a practical annoyance. Why would anyone buy vitamins at 2 in the morning? Then he realized the obvious. Children don't keep office hours for sickness. Illness doesn't wait for paper meetings.
He imagined Indy, tiny and restless, a child whose needs were immediate and uncurated by adult conveniences. The thought softened something in him he had not known was calloused. He closed his eyes and thought of a little girl who might be cold in more than one sense. Across the river, the city slept in patterns of warmth and glow. Brennan watched the transaction log for hours like someone waiting for a verdict. Dawn threaded itself into the windows and made the panes look like soft glass paintings. He decided, after an hour of passive news headlines about inflation and an article about boardroom restructurings, to climb into his car and go back to the station. He left a car idling outside the subway like a guilty adult catching up to a child's secret. The driver gave him the look of someone who had seen his boss in many states and preferred not to be in the room for this one. Brennan paid him quietly and stepped into the platform with a sense that he was the kind of person who had committed a petty crime and was returning to confess. The platform was colder than he'd thought. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Sutton was there, sitting in the same place, but the scene had changed. Indy was awake now and tugging at the coat with a small, fierce pride. Her cheeks were flushed. She had the look of someone who had been given a small kingdom and was testing its borders. The stuffed animal with the missing ear had been tucked into the child's arms like a scepter. Brennan came up to them slowly, feeling like a man approaching a private altar. He spoke first because speech felt easier than admitting how unsettled he was. "Good morning," he offered. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Sutton looked up carefully, as if she were checking whether the planet had shifted. There was a politeness in her face now that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with habit. She had been under scrutiny all her life. Scrutiny had taught her how to stay steady. "Morning," she replied. "You came back." He had not known he planned to, but he found himself relieved to see them in the same place he had left them. He thought with an odd shame that if she had been gone, the moral calculus would have been neater. Absence would have fit the story he had told himself all week. Presence complicated it. It asked him to be a person with hands. He said too quickly, "I saw the charges. You could have stayed somewhere warmer tonight." Sutton smiled in a way that was practical and used to smoothing edges. "We found a place for a few hours," she said. "A friend from the shelter called in something. Indy slept most of the night." Brennan looked toward Indy, who was now drawing with a short stub of crayon on a scrap of cardboard, the movement of her hand sure as breath. He felt, abruptly, like he was looking at himself from across a gulf, like a man from one hemisphere trying to understand a map drawn in another language.
He sat down on the concrete opposite them without thinking. The air was gray and smelled faintly of rain. There was a silence that felt less like emptiness and more like an opportunity to listen. Brennan touched the phone in his pocket as if to feel the ping vibrations and found himself looking for the next one. "Why did you give money at the shelter?" he asked finally, a question that sounded more like his father's voice than his own. He expected an answer that would justify something or prove something. Sutton's hands folded the crayon and her child's drawing. She thought a moment before she spoke, as if lining up her words in the same careful arithmetic she used to count coins. "Because someone needed a blanket more than we did," she said. "Because it was cold and they didn't have—" She stopped. Her face didn't look for pity. It was a statement of fact. Brennan had no reply that didn't sound either extravagant or condescending. Instead, he fished into his pocket, found a small business card he kept for the kinds of personal apologies billionaires give themselves, and handed it to her with a sudden, clumsy sincerity. "Come have coffee with me," he said. "Later. There's a place, quiet. I want to—" He didn't finish. There were private rules in his world about how to stitch help into the world that didn't create spectacle. He had no protocol for this. So he offered the half-formed invitation. Sutton looked at the card, then at him. There was a pause, as if she were considering whether this was another test to be passed or a genuine offer. She folded the card and tucked it into her coat. "Maybe," she said. "We have plans to be at an intake appointment at the shelter this afternoon." She did not say it as a dismissal, but as a fact of life. There were processes, people to see, forms to fill. Brennan stood and realized he felt heavy in places he hadn't planned to. The log of the night was still on his phone, the small list of transactions, like a thread he couldn't quite pull without unraveling something else. He thought of Montgomery again, that neat, instructive voice. He had started the morning wanting his father's aphorism confirmed. He found instead evidence that contradicted it in motion. "Thank you," he said abruptly. He meant it with the sincerity of someone discovering gratitude like a new instrument. He did not know whether she would accept the word. She nodded and tucked her child into a safer corner of the coat. They said a few other things that were practical and small: directions to the intake center, a map of which bus to take, an exchange of names that was not performative but necessary. Brennan watched them gather their few belongings, and then he walked away with a sense that the experiment had not closed, but had opened into something that made the edges of his life uncomfortable in a way he could not ignore. He stood under the highway for a minute, the damp air smelling of oil and possibility. His phone hummed quietly.
Then it pinged again, an afterthought in a night that was beginning to feel like an anthology of small mercies. The screen showed another line he had not expected. Indie Arts, $7.50. Crayon set, small bundle of blue and red. The children's shop had rung up the sale with the same quiet dignity as every other place. Brennan sat on a folding bench in the station and stared at his phone like a man reading a language he had been told was lost to him. The receipts read like confessionals. He had come to prove a simple point, one he had inherited as an axiom: give someone unfettered resources and you reveal their core. He had expected self-indulgence, perhaps a small measure of theft or surrender into indulgence. Instead, he had a list of modest purchases, medical items, and a donation to another struggling person. Each line suggested a sense of order that had nothing to do with scarcity alone. They suggested prioritization, a discipline shaped not by fear, but by care. That is when he felt, for the first time, a new kind of shame, Not the shame of being exposed, but the small, precise shame of being wrong in a way that required correction. It was an unpleasant sensation because it demanded something of him, not only an alteration of thinking, but some change in how he would act. It asked him to reconcile with the extra part of his life that had always sat aside like a holiday guest. He kept watching the feed as Sutton and Indy receded from the platform, blending into a city that could swallow lives like a draft. He had in his pocket the record of a stranger's choices. It felt intimate, unlikely, and, to his surprise, precious. He thought of the card in her wallet and how a simple rectangle of polymer had opened a small field of possibilities for a woman whose days were ventilated into tasks. The card, inert and banal in his pocket, had become a key to a room he had not known existed within himself. On the train home, he scrolled back through the list of charges as though he were revising a script. Each item was a clue, not to malfeasance, but to a moral geography that had not been his to map. There was, he realized, a kind of economy in Sutton's choices that he had been taught to distrust. Allocate to necessity, care for the child, give to the vulnerable. The order was not random. It had a logic that was both humble and rigorous. As the city blurred past at speed, his phone vibrated with a text from his assistant reminding him of a board meeting. He answered with a curt, almost automatic confirmation. Then he turned the phone over and left the transaction feed open. The pings had stopped for the night, but something in him had begun its own quiet, insistent rhythm. He would not sleep much. He had set in motion a tiny fracture in the wall of his certainty, and that fracture was exactly the sort of thing that invited attention. Morning came like a coin tossed into a still pond.
He made coffee that tasted of the kind of beans sourced with a mission statement and sat at a table that had never known need. He kept glancing at his phone as if the screen might provide an answer that would reassemble the night into neat categories. The messages were neutral and flat. There was, finally, one more ping as the sun spread itself like slow butter over the glass of his building. City Thrift, $12.45, children's boots. Market Fresh, $18.96, eggs, bread, canned tomatoes. He stood then, leaving coffee half drunk, and the city bending itself to its ordinary agenda. He told his driver he was going to walk for a bit. The driver, as was the practice of people who circulated near billionaire habits, asked no questions. Brennan moved through the morning like he had changed his own route. The walk felt purposeful in a way he hadn't planned. He was going back to the platform because some small, self-righteous impulse required him to see the thing with his own eyes rather than through the abstract cleanliness of a smartphone. When he reached the spot where it had happened, the morning light made the tiles look less like a place of marginalization and more like the intersection where private lives rubbed against the public. Sutton was there, in the same corner, but now with a little paper bag at her feet. She had tacked Indy's drawing with the child's uneven sun onto the front of the bag, as if it were an insignia. Indy ran to Brennan as if the world contained fewer people than it did, and all of them were benevolent. She shoved the crayon drawing at him with fierce pride. Brennan chuckled, clumsy and unfamiliar as a man unpracticed in small talk. The child's face was lit in a way he could not manufacture with money. He sat with them while light pooled around them and watched Indy color a new sky on the cardboard. Sutton held a receipt in her hand, smoothed and folded like it was a worn letter. He could see the vendor names. He could feel the weight of the numbers. He found himself asking, almost stupidly, could I see the card? She looked at him, and for the first time her look contained something like measurement. It was not a request for pity or proof. It was an inventory. "It's in my wallet," she said, "but you can see the receipts if you want." He realized he had never expected the receipts to be the thing that would move him. He had imagined some theatrical confession, an oath, a tearful narrative of gratitude. Instead, she pulled out the paper slips like pages of a small practical ledger and unfolded them. He watched the list as it was recited by omission and emphasis: the coat, the groceries, the medicine, the donation for blankets. Each line was read matter-of-factly, like instructions for living. At the bottom of one of the grocery receipts, in a line almost invisible among the numbers, was a small extra that made his throat constrict. Donation, St. Mary's Women's Shelter, $15.
She did not make a performance of her giving. The line sat there, a little constable of evidence that contradicted his textbook. "You gave to the shelter?" he asked, not wanting to sound as awed as he felt. Sutton's face registered something like the naturalness of the question. "Someone had to have a blanket," she said again. "They were shaking." Brennan could have followed his father's old logic and labeled the action as naivety or uselessness. Instead, he found himself reading the line again and thinking of the woman in the shelter whom Sutton had talked to the night before, the one with the son with asthma. It struck him then, with a force that had nothing to do with his usual measures of wealth, that the smallest acts often carried more calculated courage than the largest public gestures. There, on the concrete, and with a set of receipts between them, a distance that had been theoretical all his life began to feel like something repairable. But repair required steps he had not planned for, hours of listening, bureaucratic translation, an admission that it was not his role to be the final answer to anyone's life. He felt the pull of both possibilities, one the old antiseptic voice of institutionalized caution, the other the dizzy human urge to do more than watch. "And now?" he asked, because that was the real question. Opening a private ledger for a woman who had built her life on public necessity had consequences. Do you step in and redirect? Do you offer an immediate refuge? Do you keep the experiment as a closed circuit for your own learning and walk away wiser but unchanged? Sutton looked at him with a steady patience that suggested she had entertained the question long before he had offered it. "Now we go to the shelter intake," she said. "They'll help us with a voucher for a night room and see about longer-term housing. Indy has a place at a day program this week. I have an appointment with a social worker." She listed things with the efficiency of someone who knows how to keep systems from swallowing a person. There was no self-pity in the list. It was instead a catalog of steps, each one a small scaffolding erected against the wind. The calm of it unsettled him. He wanted drama because drama made moral decisions easy. He wanted a narrative that fit the parable he had been raised on. Instead, he found process. He found appointments and forms and other people's names attached to things that were, in their small way, bureaucratic and human all at once. As he listened, he thought about the blunt instrument his father had given him, an inherited skepticism that turned people into experiments. He had handed a piece of his life to a stranger because he wanted to test an axiom. Instead, the act had been a wedge between two worlds that had always thought themselves separate but were not. The receipts lay between them like a bridge. He felt, in that moment, the first honest ripple of responsibility, not the theatrical charity of a press release or a philanthropic gala, but the quieter kind that began with showing up and continued with messy, unphotogenic labor. He thought of the card in her wallet and felt the absurdity of the gesture he'd made 2 days earlier. He had been trying to prove his father's maxim and had become, in the process, the kind of person who had to answer to the results if they proved him wrong. Sutton stood up then, gathering Indy in both arms with the practiced motion of a woman who could hold an entire day's worth of contingency without flinching. "We should go," she said. "They're expecting us for intake at 9. Brennan watched them leave like someone who had been given the first stanza of a song he had to learn by ear. He stayed seated for a moment, the receipts folded in his pocket like evidence of a crime he wished he had never committed. He did not realize then that the action of handing over the card had already started to unmake something in him, a neat coat of cynicism chipping at the edges. When the station had emptied and the world resumed its regular commerce, Brennan made a decision that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with the small private responsibility that had lodged itself in his chest. He walked to a nearby cafe, bought 2 coffees, and asked for them to be put in paper cups to go. He moved with the kind of purpose he had only recently discovered in a life that had always been assigned purpose by markets and calendars. He walked toward the shelter intake office, but not to make a grand gesture. He simply wanted to be present, to see how the bureaucratic machinery would welcome them, to understand the contours of a need that receipts had only hinted at. He would stay out of the way. He would listen. That, he decided, was the right beginning. At the shelter, there were people who wore their hope like a threadbare scarf, visitors and counselors, volunteers with tired eyes and relentless kindness, a woman by the intake desk who nodded like a person who had sat with too many good intentions to be surprised by one more. There was a man named Carlos who took their names and checked the available vouchers. There were forms to fill, signatures to place, boxes to tick. There was also the remarkable ordinariness of other people's pain being met by other people's consistent attention. Brennan stood at a respectful distance and watched as Sutton navigated the process with a competence that had less to do with the shelter's paperwork than with her own hard-won knowledge. She spoke of Indy's allergies, of a recent job program application, of a username for an online portal she kept forgetting to check. Each detail was ordinary and necessary. Each one was a small demand for dignity. He felt the pressing urge to do more than watch, but the last thing he wanted was to turn a private test into another spectacle.
So he sat on the edge of the room with his coffee and watched the intake line move like a human tide. People signed, were handed plastic cards, received referral slips. Volunteers walked with a steady, ordinary grace. Brennan kept his cup close like a talisman and felt, more clearly than he had in years, the distance between watching and doing. If this moment is hitting you and you want more stories like it, there's a small button below you can press. Subscribe, and we'll bring you more moments like this. He had not planned to be the kind of person who sat in a shelter intake room. His life had been built on delegating the messy parts to people whose job titles handled discomfort for a living. Here, in a room that smelled faintly of detergent and coffee, there were no polished slides to hide behind, only clipboards and faces and the slow, patient bureaucracy of help. Carlos at the desk found a voucher available for that night. A volunteer arranged a temporary room at a nearby motel. There were forms to sign and a handful of documents to photocopy, birth certificates, a school record for Indy, proof of a last address that read like an answer to an old question. Sutton moved through it all with the quiet competence of someone who had learned how to make systems work for the people she loved. She spoke plainly about Indy's allergies and the appointment she had with a workforce training program later in the week. The words were concrete and small, and each one pulled tiny knots in Brennan's chest. When the clerk asked if anyone would be willing to help with the deposit for a longer transitional stay, Brennan felt his old instinct rise like an old oak sprouting in cement. His first impulse was to fund the whole thing, to write a check large enough to make headlines and be done with the moral math. That impulse tasted like spectacle. He swallowed it. Instead, he did something quieter. He gave his card to the shelter director, not to Sutton, and asked the director to help them find durable solutions, a room for the night, an appointment with a housing counselor, connections to a program that helped place single parents into job training with childcare. He asked questions he had never thought to ask. What is realistic in 60 days? What documents slow things down? Who actually helps with deposits and small one-off costs like a bus pass or a work uniform? The answers were bureaucratic and honest. They required time,
coordination, and other people's steady labor. He left with Sutton's paper forms folded into his pocket, and for the first time in his life, he felt the brute domestic weight of logistics. It was not glamorous. It was the kind of work that could not be outsourced to a funder statement or reduced to a talking point.
He made calls, quiet, awkward ones, and his assistant arranged discreetly, with no cameras and no press, for an emergency deposit and a month of childcare vouchers through a local nonprofit. Brennan learned how to translate his resources into the language the shelter used: vouchers, references, subsidized program placements. It was less immediate than a headline, but more certain. The motel room that night was small and hummed with a cheap radiator's patient warmth. Indy discovered a television in the corner and watched cartoons with the single-minded joy children have for images. Sutton locked the door and for a few hours let herself cry in the bathroom without worrying who would see. Brennan sat on the other side of the sink area and listened to the sound he had never given his life: a woman breathing out after a day of keeping things together. He brought them dinner from a local diner and left it respectful and simple: soup, bread, a foil tin of something plain and warming. "I don't want to be saved," Sutton said at one point in the low space between the television and the rain on the window. The voice was steady and exact. "I need help to stand. There's a difference." He heard the difference. He tasted it. He had come to the platform to test an aphorism about human nature, and instead had found an ethic: people who know how to distribute scarcity so the ones they love do not freeze. He promised himself he would respect the boundaries she set: assistance, not takeover. Over the following weeks, the movement of help resembled a small machine. Shelter advocates filed an application for transitional housing. A workforce agency booked Sutton for a culinary training program that offered a stipend. Childcare vouchers were confirmed for Indy at a neighborhood day program. Brennan's involvement changed shape. He used influence more than cash. Calls to a housing developer to expedite an intake, introductions to a nonprofit that managed deposits, quiet follow-through with an employment coordinator who wanted to see Sutton in person. He went to meetings not to sign checks, but to understand timelines. He listened when social workers corrected his assumptions about wait lists and eligibility, and he learned that discreet, patient toggles of attention often mattered more than a single grand gesture. There were small humiliations for both of them, forms about past addresses that made Sutton's life feel like an error, hours spent waiting in offices where fluorescent lights flattened personality. There were also small, luminous victories: an acceptance letter from the training program, Indy's enrollment confirmation, a voucher printed and taped ceremoniously to a folder. Brennan discovered a new kind of currency in the steady accumulation of these things. He also discovered how easily the wealthy misread success as immediacy. Real stability required slow scaffolding: a deposit, 3 months of steady income, child care in place, health records, and a landlord willing to take an applicant whose credit history looked like a pause. The first major day came as a cluster of practicalities: a moving truck with volunteer labor, boxes labeled in neat Sharpie, a social worker who carried paperwork and warm presents. Their new place was modest: 2 small rooms with high windows that let in a sun the color of tea. It had a working stove and a closet for Indy's crayons. On the morning they moved in, Sutton made pancakes on a pan that had been left behind by a previous tenant, and Indy doodled a house with a slanted roof and 3 windows that all glowed. Brennan arrived at the doorway carrying a box of basics someone from his company had patched together: sheets, a small kettle, a hand-me-down toaster. It was awkward to bring things with both of them in the room. He set the box down and let Sutton unpack.
He had to learn how to play a new role: friend, not rescuer; sponsor, not proprietor. He learned the painful art of asking permission before offering help. "Do you want me to call that agency? Is the deposit ready? Would you like me to set up the first grocery delivery?" Sutton asked for practical things and small mercies: assistance to cover the first month's rent while the stipend cleared, help getting a bus pass, someone to pick Indy up from the day program the week her training started. She refused headline-worthy pity. She accepted help that let her keep the shape of decision-making. The training program suited her. She had once worked in food service before losing employment and had a steady, sensible hand that fit the rhythm of a kitchen. It was the kind of job that required reliability and muscle more than abstract diplomas, and within months she was offered a position.